In this segment, I want to talk to you about cultural change. I've discussed it in the last two segments when I talked about revolution and how successful it might be, and it doesn't seem to have been very successful. I then began an argument about evolution, that evolution shows certain benefits in terms of cultural change that revolution does not. I can't say for sure what the best answer for cultural change is. There simply is not enough research on cultural change to give us the possibility of a definitive answer. It's clearly an area in which more research is necessary. But we can't stand still. We have problems of cultural clashes that are often very expensive in terms of lives and money and time and effort and all the reasons that keep us from making the ability of human beings to reach their full potential. So we need to try to find answers. And I'm going to give today the answers that I have reflected on over probably my lifetime to try to come up with something that might be researchable in the future and that might help guide us during the temporary period that we're in now, the period before we figure out what really makes cultural change possible. The first observation I have to make, I've made over and over in the course, and that is that I see the origins of culture in our own lives as lying in a period that we rarely remember, or we remember only partly fragmentary information. The period between 0 and 5 years, the period in which our brain, each of our brains, each of the Homo sapien brains, are developing outside the womb. Since they're not fully developed, the memory is not there. But the capacity to learn is there, and we're learning all the time. And we're learning from primary caregivers who, from our standpoint as very small children, are like gods. They're like the answer to everything. They feed us, they keep us warm, they change our diapers, all of these things. And they tell us things that are true. They tell us the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. They tell us if we're outside and we feel water dropping on our head, that that's rain. They tell us that if the sun's out, it's daytime, and if no sun, it's night. They tell us things that are important, like don't touch a hot stove, don't run in the street, and don't talk to strangers. And something like these messages are the messages that the Homo sapiens have been giving to each other probably for the last 100,000 years. And as language developed, it became even more obvious. And as we moved into the age in which we both could speak and could write, the ability of culture to be transmitted improved dramatically. Now, of course, it's not only what we learned in the first 5 years, it's what we learned after that, from our age mates, from schools, from religious organizations, from political organizations, from the media, all sorts of sources of information. And insofar as these messages reinforced what we learned between 0 and 5, those tend to be our cultural values. And insofar as they match the cultural values of our age mates, of the others around us, they become the culture of the area in which we live. And we know this about culture, that if you move from one area to another area, you're more likely to be influenced by the culture into which you move than you are to be affected by the culture that you left behind. And that's only natural. You're an individual, and even if you move with your family, you're moving with a very small group into a very much larger community. And that's why immigrants to the United States so frequently complain that, oh, their children have lost the values from the society in which they came. They've been Americanized. I've heard that over and over. I hear it a lot from Chinese parents, but that happens to be because I know a lot of Chinese immigrants. But it's true of all sorts of groups. So this is the source of culture. Now, this source of culture becomes a kind of a problem in some ways. We can imagine, I can imagine not just what my parents and primary caregivers in my own life said, what my parents and grandparents and older uncles and aunts and older cousins and so on said to me. Things like, don't trust strangers, don't trust outsiders. This kind of message goes on and goes on and goes on the further back we trace it in history. And it becomes the source, I am convinced, of social constructs like that of race. I have made the argument early in the course that the biological evidence is that there's only one race. But there is a perception that there are more races out there. It's based, people would like to say it's based on biological evidence, but that's not true. There's only one race, the human race, Homo sapiens, that's it. But there are different cultural groups, some of which can be identified by the appearance of the outside. On the outside, the skin color, hair texture, that sort of thing. That's the source of where we come up with ideas about race in the last couple of centuries. But you know, the concept of race didn't exist before the 17th century. So we went for 100,000 years or better without the concept of race to work with. We created it, and we can uncreate it by recognizing the simple truth that there's only one biological race. But that then throws back to the question of why is it we've done this? Well, we've done it because for about 100,000 years, primary caregivers have been telling their children, don't trust outsiders, don't trust strangers, don't trust those who are different. And they're not entirely wrong. You can't say to a small child, trust every stranger you see. That's foolishness. That's bizarre. And no one would believe that. But what is required is for us to think about what it takes to operate in a world in which we confront people in different races, in different cultures. Because there's cultures all over the place. Even within the United States, which has a dominant American culture, there are subcultures for the Deep South, subcultures for the Far West, subcultures for New England, subcultures from the Midwest, and a variety of other subcultures that are tagged to immigrant groups that came to the United States and still have some claims. So there's a Jewish subculture and a Catholic subculture and an Italian and on and on and on. It just goes forever. So what we have to do is figure out how can we learn to live in a world with different cultures. And that amounts to cultural change. That means somehow we have to move beyond what we did in the first 5 years, what we learned from our age mates going to school, what we've learned from family members and communities and from the media and so on. We have to figure out how we can move beyond that. Now this is not a new problem, because many of the cultures, unlike the American constitutional democratic culture, are not cultures of tolerance. They're not tolerance. They're not cultures in which there are rights. They're not cultures in which there's a rule of law. Some of these are hideous cultures, headed by totalitarian dictators. And we want to say, how can we change these cultures? And if you're embedded in one of those countries that has a hideous totalitarian dictatorial system, you have a hard time. You want it to be different. You want it to change. And there's where the temptation of revolution comes. And yet, if we look at the history of revolution, if we look at harsh governments, dictatorial governments, almost all of them, before major revolutions that I talked about before, the English Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, if we look at those harsh governments, we understand why people are angry, why people might wish to use violence to overthrow them. But then the lesson comes to us that over time, real cultural change didn't come from the revolutions. A lot of people died. Some of the ruling groups were eliminated, but oftentimes they were only replaced with other harsh governments. So the French Revolution had Robespierre, and the Russian Revolution had Stalin, and the Chinese Revolution had Mao Zedong. None of these were an improvement on the previous governments. And in the end, for the English Revolution, for the French Revolution, for the Russian Revolution, and for the Chinese Revolution, when we got back to the elimination of the harsh revolutionary regimes that were in place for a long period of time, the subsequent regimes look a lot like the regimes that were there before the revolution took place. So the argument for revolution that I've made is that it's problematic. It doesn't seem to work very well. Of course, there are changes in every case. France is not like the France of Louis XIV. We don't have czars anymore. We don't have an emperor in China, and you can say those are changes. But then you look at the structure of the governments, and they look rather like what they did before. So where's the problem? Well, part of the problem, I'm convinced, with revolution is the use of violence. The existence of violence will almost always trigger a reaction of violence. So one group that attacks another group, and if it's successful in the overthrow of that group, they will have made enemies, and those enemies will be biding their time until they can make a comeback. So Charles I is executed, his head is cut off, but his son gets away to another country. They didn't kill him. And he comes back, and what does he do? Puts on trial those who cut the head off his father and cuts their head off. Oh, well, there you go. How's that for permanent change? And so, too, most of the other revolutions have come to a violent end. Robespierre, at the height of the French Revolution, ended very badly. Napoleon ended badly. These are not positive experiences, and the violence is a problem. During these revolutionary periods, there's often a period of very intense revolutionary activity. A man named Crane Brinton has called this a reign of terror. And if you look at any of these four major revolutions, English, French, Russian, and Chinese, it does appear as a reign of terror. A reign of terror in which cultural change seeks to be forced on people by violent means. And this almost always provokes a reaction. I'm not entirely sure that I can track this through each of those past revolutions, but in looking at the record in China, here's what appears. During the Reign of Terror, there was a period of time when children turned against their parents, grandchildren turned against their grandparents. There was a great deal of struggle, a great deal of violence directed toward family members. And the problem with that, the very serious problem with that, is that people did not know which way to turn. The lack of any rational alternative meant that they were often felt in great anxiety, a great deal of terror in the Reign of Terror. In the Chinese case, it appears that they fell back, the people who were terrorized, fell back on the values they had between 0 and 5 years of age. When all of their conscious memories went away, they fell back on very, very primitive beliefs that carried them through the period. And when the period of violence came to an end, when Mao Zedong died, the last thing they wanted was to perpetuate that regime. Their whole hunger was to return to an earlier state that matched the experience they had between 0 and 5 years of age. And during that period of time, it was fundamental Confucian values that had been passed down for 2,500 years that they turned back to. That's why the evolutionary practice in China has been to restore the Confucian system. That's why Deng Xiaoping's great success was simply in saying, we, the Chinese people, are in a hole. And what we need to do is follow the first rule of holes. When you're in one, stop digging. He stopped digging. He pulled back on the Maoist principles. He allowed the underlying Confucian culture to reemerge. And what has emerged in China is a very strong, very vibrant economy. Are there changes? Yes, there are. Foot binding is a thing of the past. We don't do foot binding in China anymore. The extreme harsh conditions that said under no circumstances will be divorce, that's also gone. People can get divorces, men can get divorces, women can get divorces. There is a greater equality. The status of women in the workplace has improved. And all of these things, well, these things aren't the result of the violent revolution. These are things that started before the revolution and have continued after the revolution because they were a part of evolutionary changes that have been going on. Some of them linked clearly to the economic system, and some of them were alien and tacked onto the structure to begin with. Foot binding? You want to blame that on Confucius? I don't think so. It wasn't invented until 1,000 years after Confucius had died. And it lasted for a few hundred years until finally the customary practice ended. The great argument, it's not a perfect argument, is that evolution stands a better chance of success than revolution. That's why those people who've advocated nonviolent solutions, Christ, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, have often made greater contributions to cultural change than the violent people whose names are not worthy to mention.